Well, thank you very much for being here, and I want to... Can you put up your hand if you can hear me very well? So can you put up your hand if you don't think you can hear me very well? Okay. How about now? No? Yes? See? See? How about no? Just one person. Thank you so much for being here, and I want to thank my friend and colleague Roberto for inviting me. I've been to Colombia a few times. It's one of my very favourite places, and tonight I'm lucky enough to go to Cartagena, which I just think is a terrific place. Every time I come to Colombia, I end up talking about the same thing. And it seems to me that this issue is not going away in Colombia, and it's not going away in many other countries of the world. Basically, there is no student loan system anywhere in the world that works wonderfully well. And there are some student loan systems in many places in the world which work very poorly. So I want to talk to you about student loans. Please indicate, put up your hand if you've ever had a student loan. Excellent. Can you put up your hand if you're very, very happy with your student loan? I count nobody. Oh, there is one person. So I've been to maybe 20, 25 different countries over the last 20 years to talk about student loan systems, and the only thing they all have in common is that people know that they can be improved. And the kind of way to think about this, the economic way to think about this, I'm going to talk to you about the concepts and about the theory behind student loans. Those of you who have tried all of your life to avoid hearing a lecture in economic theory, I've got some very bad news for you. This is going to happen today. And I don't think you can escape without being noticed. After I do this, after I talk about the theory and the concepts that economics brings to student loans, I then want to talk about some data, some statistics, which I think highlight the most important single aspect in the comparison of different student loans. And I'll share that with you now. It's called a repayment burden. And the repayment burden refers to your capacity as a graduate or as a student debtor broadly to be able to afford to repay your student loan. It is a proportion of your income that is needed so that you can pay off your student loan. And when that number becomes very big, you are in trouble. Because if it takes a lot of your income to pay your student loan, the chances are you'll be suffering in paying it because you won't have enough income for other things, and this will lead, very likely, to a high proportion of people with the incapacity to pay their loan defaulting on the loan. And defaults are very expensive. They're very expensive for governments, but they're also very expensive for graduates and students. So here's the overview of this talk. I'll take you all the way back to Australia in 1989, where that country introduced a different way of understanding and operating a student loan system. This is called an income contingent loan. And if you may not have heard of that. Very few people in many countries have heard of income contingent loans, although there are now about 8 or 9 countries that use an income contingent loan. And the first place to do this was Australia, and it operated through the tax system. I'll tell you all about that. And I'll tell you about the income contingent loan system. And you might be quite surprised to hear about this income contingent loan system, because if you've had a loan in this country, you would not have had an income contingent loan. You will have had what's called a mortgage loan. And I'm going to compare and contrast an income contingent loan with the kind of loan that you may have or may have had. So there'll be some theory here. The most important theoretical point is that governments must intervene in student loans, because this is what economists call a capital market failure. If there is no government intervention in the student higher education financing, then many poor people will not be able to go. And that's a waste of resources, and it's also very unfair that if you come from a low family income and you can't access higher education because there is no proper student loan system. Then I'll do the comparison of the mortgage loan versus income contingency, and then I want to get into the data, and I think the data are extremely revealing about repayment burdens. I don't know if you know this expression, they're hot off the press. We have just finished this work for Ireland, and Ireland is like at least 20 other countries in the world right now thinking very seriously about changing its higher education funding system. So I've done some work with my colleague Dean Douris on the repayment burdens that might exist if Ireland introduces a mortgage loan. And I'm going to summarise those data for many other countries. We're just starting to do this work for Colombia, but it is too early to report on that. I'll then talk about income contingent loans as an alternative to a mortgage loan. And here's the most important point of all. If you take away nothing from this lecture except this point, I will be very happy. An income contingent loan sets a maximum of your income that you are able to use to repay a student loan. In Australia, it's 8%. So it doesn't matter what your income is. If you've got the student loan system in Australia, which about 100% of the students do, when they repay, they are never forced or required to put in more than 8% of their income. And compared to many countries' loan systems, that is a very low figure. So I'll take you back to Australia in 1989. We had what was called a free system. Now, any economist will tell you that there is no such thing as a free higher education system. So when people talk about free university, they mean free to the student at the point of entry, because somebody has to pay for a university system. And the Australian government, that is, in other words, the Australian taxpayer, paid for 100% of university costs up until 1989. And then the government decided to introduce tuition. This is a fairly straightforward concept if you come from Colombia, because there's tuition all the way through your university systems, but that's not true for many other countries. And it wasn't true for Australia, England, New Zealand, South Africa, Wales, Scotland, and many other places in the late 1980s. That's now no longer true. But there are many countries in Western Europe which effectively do not have any charges for students to go to university, such as Sweden, such as Denmark, and in effect, such as Germany, and in Italy and France, the fees are quite low. That is not true for most countries in the world, and some of these countries, the ones that I've just mentioned, Australia, New Zealand, England, Wales and South Africa, introduced contingent loan mechanisms to help people pay their tuition. And this is how it works. If you go to an Australian university, you don't pay anything. You can if you like, but there's no reason to pay. But you can enrol without paying a cent or a peso, particularly a cent actually, or a dollar. However, to stay at that university, to enrol, you need to sign a contract, and the contract has you agreeing as a student to repay the loan, but only when your income reaches a certain level. Let me tell you currently what that level is. That level in Australian dollars is $54,000 per year. That is approximately $45,000 US per year. So if you enrol in an Australian university and you graduate from the university, but over your lifetime you never earn more than US $45,000 per year, you pay nothing. It is free if you have low income. There are some people in the Australian system who will pay back their debt very quickly. The debts are typically of the order of $20,000 US, which is about the same as the debts are in the United States. But that $20,000 to be repaid can take your whole life if you don't earn very much, It can never be repaid by about 10% of the people, and the average person will pay, the average student or graduate will pay it off in about 8 to 12 years. Any time you have a problem in the labour market, for example, you are unemployed, for example, you withdraw from the labour market to look after a sick parent or to look after an infant, or you work part-time, or more interestingly, I think, if you don't graduate and you end up with a low income, in all of those periods you pay nothing. And that's the critical point, because there is no other kind of student loan system which forgives you on the basis of your income except an income contingent loan. That didn't exist anywhere. It existed in people's heads and it existed in textbooks, but it wasn't in operation in any country before 1989 in a national basis. The very first income contingent loan actually did not come from Australia. It was instituted at Yale University in 1974, and Yale University allowed its graduates to have an income contingent loan, and several very famous people were in that system. One had the name Bill Clinton, and the other had the name Hillary Clinton. And both Bill and Hillary Clinton paid off their loans to Yale University, and they kind of liked this system. They liked it to the point where Bill Clinton introduced a variation of a contingent loan in 1994 into the US Stafford loan system. It is very poorly designed and almost nobody takes it up. It's almost impossible, in my view, to actually understand it, so that there's no kind of surprise that the take-up is low. The Yale system did not work, and it did not work because Yale might be a very fine institution at educating people, but it's not very good at collecting debt. And the trouble with collecting an income contingent debt is that you have to know what the income of your graduates is. And that was the innovation in Australia, because if you use the Internal Revenue Service or the Tax Office, they have got the legal jurisdiction to know exactly what your income is. And moreover, it is all the way through the country. So we don't have much of an informal sector. I know that's not true in this country, and certainly many of the other countries I know, such as in Asia, where the informal sectors are big, but just about everybody was covered with the income tax system, and the marginal cost, that is the extra government outlays to operate this system through the income tax arrangements, was close to zero. So it works very efficiently. It may not work in other countries very efficiently, and there are some countries where people do not make contributions to income tax or do not make contributions to social security, which depends on their income. So, for example, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, I don't think they should think about income contingent loans. So after Australia, this idea, which we were told at the time would not work, the tax system said it's impossible, no country's done this, we can't possibly do it, it'll be a big mess, there's no way that it would work. They made it work, it's worked very efficiently. And when it was seen to work very efficiently, other countries got a bit interested in this as well. The first country after Australia to use the national tax system to collect income was a country called New Zealand. Now, you may not know this, but New Zealand is very close to Australia geographically, and they were close to us kind of intellectually too, so they kind of knew who to talk to in the Australian context if they were going to operate this system in New Zealand. Excuse me. Excuse me. So the system went to New Zealand in 1992, and not long after that, South Africa got a bit interested and introduced a variation of this. And then in 1997, England and Wales introduced a variation of this as well. But in 2005, England and Wales then made it completely comprehensive, very much like the Australian system. In 2006, Thailand introduced this system. It lasted for about 10 minutes, unfortunately, because it was announced by Prime Minister Thaksin a little bit before he left Thailand, never to return. Well, not never to return, but he hasn't returned since. But he did announce that not only was the system going to operate, but he was kind of the inventor of the system. So when Prime Minister Thaksin was deposed by a coup, they said, and your loan system can go as well. So it didn't last for very long in Thailand. But in those other countries, it still exists and has become more widespread. And in Australia, for example, it now covers all of tertiary education. It's now in all of the private sector. It is now in all the graduate courses, and is used in part to finance Australian students who study overseas. Quite recently, the Netherlands have adopted a variety of contingent loans, as has South Korea, and there are many other countries where it's very close and it's very upfront in the higher education financing debate, such as Malaysia is one. I think it will become important in Brazil. My impression is that higher education funding is a big deal also in Colombia. So I'm going to start with some pictures. Here's a picture. It is called an Australian female age earnings profile. In labour economics, one of the things we do an awful lot of is construct simple relationships which look at the role of education and labour market experience on income. This basically shows you, for an Australian woman who is a Year 12 graduate, that is a high school graduate only, this is what her income will look like on average, or would have looked like in 2004. That's the blue line. And if she had a twin sister who decided to go to university, that's the pink line. And you can see that the incomes of the graduate are much higher than the incomes of the non-graduate. And let me say, that is true for Australian males. And by the way, I don't need to use 2004, I could use 2016. The data are very robust. And these relationships are very consistent across many, many different countries. I'll show you another country much closer to you than to Australia. This is Mexico. These are the structural relationships, pesos per hours of the graduate males in Mexico compared to the non-graduate males, and that is true also for females. Now I'll tell you an interesting story. Well, it's a story I think is interesting. A few years ago I was in Canada and I was discussing Canadian age income profiles. And in those days we didn't have PowerPoint, we used transparency. So put up your hand if you've heard of a transparency. Transparency, has anyone actually used a transparency? I had a transparency and I thought it was Canadian age earnings profiles. So I was giving this talk referring to these profiles, and I'll show you what they look like. They kind of look like that. Now, I don't know if you know much about Canadians, but my impression of Canadians is that they're generally very polite people. But there was one person in the audience, a Canadian, who was not a very polite person. And he said to me, "Why are you showing us these relationships? Everybody in this room knows that they look like that. We're all labour economists. So in effect, why don't you say something interesting?" So I decided that I should move away from the age earnings profiles and talk about other parts of the work that I was reporting in the seminar. This is a bit interesting because when I got back to my hotel room, I noticed on a desk the transparency that I thought I'd shown them. And the transparency said Canadian age earnings profiles. And I thought, how intriguing. I wonder what I actually did show them. And when I looked very closely at what I'd shown them, I'd actually shown them Chinese age earnings profiles. These were the profiles that they saw on the transparency that they said, this is very uninteresting, you showing us those data, because everybody knows what Canada looks like. And you know what Canada looks like? Canada looks like China in structure. So I had all the transparencies. I had the Canadian one, I had the China one, I had Australian, I had the US, I had English, and I put them all next to each other just to see how common the structural relationships were across countries, and they were all the same. That doesn't mean that earnings are the same, it means the actual nature of these relationships across countries is very similar. And the first age earnings profile I've ever heard of was collected in the north of England in the 1840s, with people who had had a little bit of training, not university, but they'd gone on beyond where people had left school and they got diplomas, and the data looked the same as that too. And the lesson for me was that if I'm using a transparency, it doesn't matter which country I go to, I only have to take one of them because they look so similar. Now this doesn't mean that the human capital theory which underlies this way of thinking is accurate, but it does seem to suggest that there are profound structural similarities in the relationships between graduate and non-graduate incomes in the cross-section over the life cycle. And these data are typically used to justify the intervention in higher education so that people do pay tuition. And the reason that you can make that case. It's basically an equity case. Should you have a system that's paid for 100% by taxpayers, when actually the people who go on to university and get degrees typically do very well over their life cycle? And that's essentially the argument that's made in those countries for the introduction of tuition. Now, I now want to start on the theory. And the first point I want to make about the theory is that you really do need governments involved in these processes. And let me explain why. Imagine a world where governments were not involved in universities, but the universities was charging tuition. Ask yourself this question: if you didn't have the money to pay, would you be able to borrow it from the bank? If you think that that would be straightforward, then it's not a world that I understand. And let me explain to you why a bank does not really want to give you money for a student loan. The first point is, they don't know how well you're going to do. In my country, something like 25% of people who enrol in undergraduate education do not complete. And that figure looks about the same in the United Kingdom. I don't know the figure for Colombia. I would not be surprised if it's 25%. The second point is about the uncertainty, because all of those people who enrolled in Australia, I'm completely confident they expect to complete, but only 3 out of 4 do complete. The second point is ability and interest. Many of us do not know what we like until we do it. This is called an experience good. And you can't actually read the university handbook and know if you're going to like studying something. You basically have to be engaged in it to see if it's your kind of thing. And a very large proportion of people, when they get enrolled in a particular area, change their minds and do something else. So just indicate if you've ever changed your mind about what you wanted to study at university. Nobody? Well, I did, lots. Most people have done this. Many of my friends said to me when they were studying economics, "This is terrible. This is the most boring thing I've ever seen. I've got to leave this." And they went and studied law, which I thought was very, very odd. But it just goes to show that we're all different and we don't really know what we're doing, basically, until we try it. And if you kind of know what you want to do and you kind of don't think you're going to change your mind and you're very sure you're going to complete, there's something you don't know that nobody knows about. It's called the future. It's called the future labour market. And in some areas like teaching or nursing or public sector administration, it doesn't really matter that much because they're fairly stable occupations. But there are other occupations which have a very high variance in employment and unemployment. The best example from my country is mining. So we have mining booms. We just had a very big mining boom. Thank you very much to China mainly. But we've had mining booms which go for 10 or 12 years. Many of them don't go for more than about 4 or 5 years. And many of the people I started studying with, we've started studying in the middle of a very lucrative mining boom in Australia. And I can remember them saying, "We're going to get these fantastic jobs as geologists." Well, it takes 4 years to become a geologist. Well, at the end of the 4 years, there wasn't a mining boom, there was a mining slump. And these people did not get jobs in geology. Most of them ended up in the public sector doing work or teaching, or switched and did something else. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. So if the bank just looks at you and says, "Well, I don't know if this person is going to complete. I don't know if they're going to find the right thing to help them complete. And who knows what the market will look like for them in 4 years' time. Why should I take the risk?" And the answer is, you wouldn't take the risk unless there is this thing called collateral. Collateral is insurance, and the reason that a bank is very happy to lend to you when you purchase a house is because the bank is purchasing the house. The bank owns the house. And if you default on your mortgage, the bank will be annoyed, but it won't kill them. They'll still be able to sell the house. So they'll make less money than they did before, but it's not very risky. But if a student defaults on a loan to a bank, this is the basic economic problem, the bank cannot sell the student's brain. There is no market for brains. And one of my friends said to me after a particularly indulgent period as an undergraduate, he said, "You know, When I was talking to him about this, he said at the end of my undergraduate degree, I didn't think my brain was worth all that much, actually. But it didn't matter what his brain was worth, there is no market. So that is why banks do not give loans to students. It's risky and there's no insurance for them. So that's the basic problem for the bank. There's no saleable collateral. And the basic problem for the student is that if they don't have parents or family or partners or their own savings to get them into a university, they can't go. And the essential problem then is a societal economic problem. So there are people who've got the motivation and the talent and the intelligence and the capacity and the interest to go to university, and we won't let them because we don't have a financing system. That's a waste. It's a waste of human capital. It's societally very costly, and moreover, it's a big deal if you care about poverty, because the single most important contribution to poverty is access to education. And if poor people can't go into university because the banks won't give them a loan, then we perpetuate those very strong cycles between parental poverty and child access to education. So there are social and equity issues here as well as waste issues. This is why economists basically all agree, which is kind of a weird thing to say because generally economists don't agree about anything. The only thing that they used to agree about is that they didn't agree about anything. There was one other thing that they seemed to agree about, which was that we all hate tariffs, but there has emerged over the last 25 years something that all economists understand, which is that the capital market, the borrowing market for students, does not work. It needs government intervention. And the kind of interventions that are there basically are about risk. Risk is the single most important issue when trying to understand a student loan. So if you want a bank to lend money to relatively poor students, you've got to take away the risk that the student will default and leave you, the bank, with no money. How does the government do that? One of two ways. They guarantee the loan. So this happens in the United States, this happens in Canada, this happens in a roundabout way in Thailand, and it happens in your country. It's just that you don't have the banks involved, but you basically have a government bank which is providing the resources, so there's no risk. There is risk, but it's picked up by the taxpayer essentially. And in the Canadian system, where the banks provide the money, for the students who don't repay, the bank says to the government, well, they've defaulted on the loan, please pay it. In some cases, that actually means the banks don't chase the students too much. So who picks it up then? The taxpayer picks it up then. So you can solve the problem, the risk problem for the lender, by offering a government guarantee or by having the loan run through the public sector as yours does and as Thailand's does and as now the United States does. That will fix the problem. It'll fix the problem for the lender, the bank, or the government providing the money, but I'll illustrate in a minute that it does not fix the problem for the student. The risk gets transferred to the student. So there is still risk in these kind of loans. It's just that the risk is not there for the institution that provides the money. And the other type of loan is the one I described for the Australian situation, called an income contingent loan. No bank is involved. You don't even need money. You basically need a contractual arrangement where the government pays the university at the point of enrolment, and then the government gets the money back from the student if the student's income reaches a certain level. That's our system. That's the income contingent loan system. It's also the system in New Zealand and England and Wales and Hungary and South Korea and the Netherlands and South Africa. So kind of about half or less of the student loan systems do not have banks, do not have government guarantees for the lender. They have income contingency. I've talked about this a little bit. I'll now talk about it a little bit more. What is the cost and benefit of a normal, when I say normal, I mean a mortgage loan, and I'm going to make a comparison with an income contingent loan. The critical point about a mortgage loan, like Isatex, is that it has to be paid in a set time period. You might choose the time period to be 5 or 10 years, but you can't vary it depending on your income. And that is true with the United States system too. The Stafford loan system typically has a time limit of 10 years. What does this mean? It means that you face a fixed repayment amount for every month for 10 years, no matter what. That's the US system. With the ISATEC system, you will face a fixed amount that you must pay no matter what for 5 years or for 10 years. And in Thailand, it's a 15-year period. The critical point, it is set by time, and the amount that you owe does not vary. It is the same as what you pay for your mortgage. What's the benefits of this? Well, the finances, if it comes from a bank, the finance is provided pretty easily. The second benefit is it provides insurance for the bank, because if the student doesn't pay, the taxpayer does. There's several costs. The cost number one, usually these are not universal, because the government has to pay in the event of a default, so they don't give it to everybody. It's usually means tested on the basis of family income. Secondly, there is no insurance against default. This is such a big deal. Anyone with a mortgage-type loan faces the prospect of default. And I assure you that default is expensive, and I'll illustrate that in a minute. And then the third possible cost is what we call repayment hardship. You might keep on repaying your loan when your income is low, but you'll not have a very happy time. And the reason that you won't have a very happy time is that the loan obligation could eat away at your income in ways that mean you don't have much disposable income left. So those three things are really very important, and I'll just give you an illustration of how important they can be. This is a poster from the Canada Student Loan Office. It's a bit hard to read. If you like French, you can read the left-hand side. If you prefer English, you can read the right-hand side. The next time I come, I'll put a Spanish version out. I want to focus on this poster. When I say this is a poster from the Canada Student Loan Office, it's not really, because I stole it. But they seem to have a lot of them. So I took this back to Australia because it makes the point very clearly about the problems with mortgage loans. It says repay your Canada student loan, and if you go about halfway down, it says, if maybe you can read this, maybe you can't, it says consequences if you don't. And then there's a little dot point, which is the biggest, should be the biggest dot point of all when it comes to understanding student loans. The consequences of you not paying, it says poor credit rating. This is huge. If you default on a student loan in Canada, you've got a problem. And this problem will go on for a very long time. And the problem will surface the next time you want a big loan from a bank, like to purchase a house, because you won't get that loan. Or if you get it, the interest rate will be relatively high. Or they'll say, you've got to re-establish your credit reputation, you have to spend another 5 years waiting. So the idea that you just default on a loan and everything's fine, it's not true. The protection that is offered with mortgage loans are basically for the provider of the finance, for the lender. They do not protect the student against default, and they do not protect the student from repayment difficulties if their income is low. Imagine if as soon as you graduate with a debt, you can't get a job. So a few years ago, in many countries, that was completely clear that the unemployment rates had gone up so much in the late 2000s that the graduates in the United States typically had fairly long periods of unemployment, and they had fairly large instances of unemployment. What happens to their student loan? Do you think the bank or the government says, don't worry about that, just pay it when you feel like it? No, you can default almost straight away. Because when you're unemployed, your income is got to be very low. And the people who don't default, who are unemployed, are getting help from other people, like their parents, or from other loan arrangements, which might be very expensive, or from friends. So the protection of default is not a characteristic of a mortgage loan, but it is a characteristic of an income contingent loan. So this is a loan whereby if you don't have the money, nobody cares about this in the short run. You'll be asked to repay this debt if your income goes up in the future. So if you enter the labour market and you're unemployed for 6 months, your obligation for your loan is zero. And then if you get, this is in the Australian case, if you get a job and you earn $50,000 Australian, your obligation to repay is zero. If you do extremely well in the labour market and you get a terrific high income job straight away, say $80,000, you'll pay about 8% of your income for the loan. But at any time in the future where your life is in trouble financially, there's no issue. And it's not called default. It's not a default because you're still in the system and you can come back later to pay if your income recovers. So it offers insurance against default. So a really bad situation does not harm your credit reputation. It's just not there. It's irrelevant. It also provides insurance against difficulties of repaying. So if you've got a mortgage type loan, but you've got not a very good job, you still have to pay the same amount of loan repayment. That is not true in the income contingent world. I now want to talk about this concept of a repayment burden, and I've already touched on it. It is so important in understanding the costs and benefits of particular type of loan arrangements. It's a very simple ratio. It's the amount of money you have to pay for your loan as a proportion of your income. That's it. It's the loan repayment in period T, like in a year, in the first year in which you graduate, divided by your income. And if that number's about 10%, you're probably fine. But if you're unemployed, that number can't be 10% because the loan repayment is set. That doesn't vary. That's given because it's a mortgage type loan, but your income can vary. So what determines how easy or hard these loans are is very much given by the level of income you experience. And if you have a bit of bad luck, like you enter the labour market when there's a recession and you're unemployed, that repayment burden could be high. And when I say high, in some countries we've looked at, and I'll explain this in a minute, some people face repayment burdens of up to 70 or 80% of their income. This is not unusual, but it's only for the people who don't do very well in the labour market. Most mortgage type loans aren't a problem for the average graduate. They become a very big issue for people who don't have the jobs or people who end up in what economists call the tails of the distribution. In the bottom 25% of the income for a graduate, the repayment burdens can get very high. They'll also be higher. The higher is the interest rate, the bigger is the loan, the shorter is the repayment period. Some government loan systems have repayment periods as short as 5 or 10 years. Many other countries have loan repayment periods which are much longer than that. So the more you crunch up the loan obligation, the higher becomes the repayment burden. I now want to share with you some data. So a colleague of mine, Dean Doris, and I have been looking at Ireland. Ireland's kind of interesting because they have so-called free higher education. Nobody has to pay except the taxpayer, and the taxpayers pay 100%. We wanted to ask the question for Ireland because they're just about to introduce a loan system. They just don't know which one they want. But if they introduce a mortgage type loan system, we wanted to ask the question, if you turned out as an Irish graduate to be in the bottom 25% of the people who are graduates in Ireland with a mortgage loan, how much of your income would you need to pay the loan? We can do this for Colombia. We're starting to do this from Colombia. We're doing it for Brazil and China because these are all countries looking at their higher education financing issue. And so the econometrics of this is kind of technical and kind of sophisticated, but we don't need to understand the complexities of the estimation arrangements. We just need a couple of simple figures. So what we did, Adine and I, we designed a hypothetical loan system for Ireland, which was they had to pay 50% of the amount of money for the loan system, 50% of tuition, and they had a 10-year time period. Fairly straightforward, basically. And in this 10-year time period, we asked the question, if you're in the bottom 20% of the distribution of incomes for Irish graduate women, how much of your loan would you have to, how much of your income would you need? What is your repayment burden? The number was 75%. That was the story, basically, with a fairly benign, normal kind of loan system. And it basically leaves us with the following point. If you end up in the bottoms of the distribution, even for graduates, with mortgage-type loan systems, you can end up with very high repayment burdens. We also looked at the average. The average was fine. The average was about 15%. So you could say to the Irish government, if all you care about is the average, go ahead. But if you actually care about the people in the bottom parts of the distribution, they're the ones who have repayment difficulties, and they're the ones that are much more likely to default. And the higher is the default, the greater is the cost to taxpayers, as well as the greater is the cost to the debtor. You don't want this system in Ireland. You want to do it differently. And one way of doing it differently is a contingent loan. So we started out by looking at this in Colombia a very long time ago, and we got relationships and numbers that look very similar to Ireland. That was with the ISOTEX scheme of about 10 years ago. I don't know what the story is now, but I hope to find out pretty soon. We've done these exercises for Vietnam, Indonesia and Germany and the United States, and it's just like those age earnings profiles. The numbers are really, really similar. For typically designed student loan systems, for people in the bottom 25% of the distribution will face repayment burdens of between 60 and 80% in all of those countries. What will happen if they introduce those systems? I think the defaults will be very high, and certainly the repayment burdens will be very high as well. Here's my discussion on this, which is, I won't be introducing anything new here, because I'd really like to open it up so we can have some questions and comments. An income contingent loan is a very different way of thinking about student financing, and it's got these two characteristics that normal loans don't have. Economists call the first one consumption smoothing. And that basically means we take more from you when you've got more, and we don't take anything from you when you've got nothing. We have consumption smoothing in all kinds of ways of doing public policy. The income tax system is consumption smoothing. If you don't earn anything, you don't pay taxes. And if you earn an awful lot, you'll pay more. A little bit like the social security contributions arrangements, which I believe exist in this country. They're big in the United States, for example, and people pay more into social security the higher is their income. This is called consumption smoothing. And the other characteristic of an income contingent loan is that it has this thing called DI, default insurance. You don't have to ever worry about defaulting on an income contingent loan if you haven't got the money. If you haven't got the money, it doesn't matter. It's all transferred. The problem is transferred to the future. So these concepts of the repayment burden, which we're starting to do in many, many countries, including here, are completely important because they'll indicate how hard or easy it is for a graduate to survive with a mortgage loan and how likely it is that there'll be defaults. And these repayment burdens, I alluded to them all, but there's a million papers on this. Basically, they look very similar across these quite different countries. The numbers approach 60 to 80% of repayment burden difficulties, usually for quite young graduates, because that's when their incomes are particularly low, and that's when the difficulties are particularly high. Now, an income contingent loan solves all this problem, and it can be, in some countries, collected very efficiently. It costs about 3% in Australia, 3% of the annual revenue from our system to collect it. It will be different in other countries. It will be much higher if you've got a lot of graduates in the informal sector, and then you have to think twice about whether or not you want an income contingent loan, because it's hard to actually find, to take repayments contingent on income if there more people are in the informal sector. In most countries in Western Europe, and certainly for North America, and for some countries, I believe, in South America, and emergingly in other countries in Asia, the transactional efficiencies of collection are doable. I'll point out one other thing about loans. Collection is the biggest point of all. And many normal loan systems have very high default rates and very high non-repayment rates as well. Thank you for your attention.